President Biden officially signed the debt ceiling deal into law a short time ago. And while the administration is framing it as a win for the American people, if you look at the fine print, you can actually see just how much Americans stand to lose here. For starters, the bill ends Biden's freeze on student loan payments, requiring them to resume at the end of August. The deal doesn't affect the administration's student debt cancellation plan, but that, unfortunately, is still at risk with the Supreme Court set to decide its fate next month. The bill also increases work requirements for federal food and cash assistance. And even though veterans and people experiencing homelessness would be exempt from those requirements, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities actually estimates that nearly 750,000 adults aged 50 to 54 are now at risk of losing their SNAP benefits. And to the dismay of environmentalists and local residents, as I mentioned earlier, a 300-mile-long natural gas pipeline stretching from West Virginia to Southern Virginia has now been fast-tracked for completion. The bill contains special permits for the pipeline that will be issued within the next 21 days. Joining me now is Democratic Congresswoman Melanie Stansbury of New Mexico. She is a member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. She voted against the bill. Congresswoman, it's great to have you back on the show. Thank you so much for making time for us. I first want to ask you about your vote on this bill. I had Congressman Schneider earlier from Illinois. He explained to us why he voted for it. Make the case why you ultimately decided to vote against it, and what are you most concerned about as Biden now has signed this into law?
Well, thanks so much for having me on the show. Look, for every single Democrat who had to cast their vote this week, this was an incredibly difficult vote. I don't know a single Democrat who wasn't tortured by this decision, because at the end of the day, we were being held hostage by a GOP who literally didn't care if they tanked our economy. They took us hostage. They told us basically if we didn't relent to their demands, they would tank our economy. They would throw us into a recession. We're talking about millions of people who could have been out of work, losing their life savings. And so President Biden took them back to the negotiating table. And I want to note, after they left for the weekend, over Memorial Day weekend, and brought them back and said, we have to resolve this before we go over the brink. But at the end of the day, the bill was a bad deal. It put into place what I feel are really unconscionable compromises. As you mentioned, it will compromise food assistance for over 700,000 Americans. It guts the National Environmental Policy Act. I am the ranking member of one of the subcommittees on the Natural Resources Committee. It cuts billions of dollars in funding for our communities, tribal education programs, food programs, and it decouples military and non-military spending. And frankly, it sets us up for another budget battle over the next 18 months. And so I could not, in good conscience, knowing that we had enough votes to pass the bill and would not allow, not a single Democrat would have allowed our president or our country to fail, I knew that I could not, in good conscience, vote for this bill.
And let me ask you about how it's being framed. During President Biden's remarks, he framed this as the debt ceiling bill as a bipartisan budget agreement, and he said that it is, quote, essential to the progress we've made over the last few years. Do you generally agree with that framing, or do you feel that this is not a Republican Party that is genuine or good faith negotiators, and therefore to try to sell this as an agreement or compromise or not everybody got what they wanted is misleading, and that really Democrats were kind of held hostage here because they care about the economy while Republicans just wanted to go over the cliff if they want to drive home a point?
I think the bigger picture is really important here. Republicans were not only holding us hostage and the president hostage, they were holding the entire country and the entire global economy hostage. And I can tell you, because I walk the halls of the Capitol every day, and last Wednesday, when they all got on planes and went home to go to fundraisers, many of them didn't care if they tanked the economy. And so when the president says that he had to make this compromise in order to save the country and save the economy, he is telling the truth, because they didn't care. And so at the end of the day, it was the lesser of two evils in a sense. But for those of us who took a stand, who said, we're going to stand up against the bullies, we're going to stand up for all the bad things that are in this bill, we're going to take a stand for all the hundreds of thousands of people who are going to lose food assistance, and for the environment and for climate change, and we're going to cast a no today, we had to have both. because we couldn't allow this bill to fail. And in the end, it passed with 314 votes because the vast majority of Democrats who helped this bill pass knew that we couldn't default. And those of us who decided to vote no, who frankly were many of the folks in leadership and committees of jurisdiction. We're talking the ranking member of appropriations, of natural resources, of rules, and lots of subcommittees that cover these topical areas could not vote for a bill in good conscience, which gutted environmental programs and food assistance and community-based programs. It's a bad deal.
Let me ask you about some of the specifics and your constituents here. There is Biden, has said that Democrats' concerns about folks going hungry because of the new work requirements for food assistance was, quote, a ridiculous assertion. As someone who has to answer to your constituents, what is your response to the president saying that? What do you hear from people on the ground in New Mexico about their needs?
Well, listen, I grew up on food assistance. I grew up in a very low-income family. And what this bill does, I spent countless hours in briefings this week with subject matter experts, with the White House, with my colleagues. And I think we all understand the implications of this bill. And why people are mad is because at the end of the day, Republicans held us hostage at gunpoint in our economy and tried to balance the budget on the backs of poor people like they've done time and time again, and on the environment. The impacts of this bill is that we know that older Americans, folks who are over 50, are going to lose food assistance because of this bill. That's just a fact. Now, on the other side of the equation, the Biden administration was able to negotiate some changes to SNAP for our veterans, for people with disabilities, that ultimately the CBO tells us is going to bring more people onto food assistance, which is wonderful. But for those individuals, those folks who are actually going to lose their food benefits, it's going to directly harm people. And the reason ultimately I could not vote for this bill, not just because of the environmental impacts, is that as somebody who grew up in a low-income family, I felt that we had to honor the humanity of the people who would be impacted and to not lie to the American people about what the impacts of this bill actually are going to be.
Let me ask you about the construction of that Mountain Valley pipeline. That is something for Senator Joe Manchin. He has clearly pushed for it. We know that he has received more campaign donations from gas pipeline interests than any other senator in the United States Congress. And that passage of the debt ceiling is supposed to be a rudimentary process. Yet monkeyed interests are making their way into these agreements. And it just kind of taints the entire process, that what is supposed to be a rudimentary budgetary process is now incorporating these favors or these types of transactions, if you will, for senators like Joe Manchin who want a pipeline fast-tracked.
Well, I think in this particular case, and I'm very opposed to this pipeline, the president made a commitment to Senator Manchin that he would assist with the permitting of that pipeline in exchange for his vote over the Inflation Reduction Act. I think the White House and the president have been very transparent about that. It didn't pass when we tried to pass a budget bill in December, and so it got shoehorned into this deal. But that is not the only problematic environmental provision in this bill. For me, as I said, as a ranking member of a committee of jurisdiction, this bill guts the National Environmental Policy Act. It puts into place definitions and exemptions that the Trump administration forced through at the end of the administration, and which we tried to get out of our public rulemaking process and now are put into statute. So there is a lot of really damning and damaging provisions that ended up in this bill. And we were under a situation in which the GOP and the extremists in the GOP were ready to take us over the cliff. So the president had to do what he had to do. Democrats stood with the president. I stand with the president. I support his decision to negotiate a bill, but we're going to have some hard work in front of us to fix these environmental provisions and to make sure that we can make good on our commitments and responsibilities to all Americans to make sure that they have access to food, putting a roof over their head, and to all of the students and folks out there who are going to be saddled once again with student debt.
Congresswoman Melanie Stansbury from New Mexico. Congresswoman, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. Greatly appreciate it.